Greetings, comrades. From its very inception, the Soviet Union positioned itself as a new type of state, free from the prejudices and shortcomings of all previous outdated forms. From inequality, religion, oppression, and a million other things. Instead, the USSR promised to build nothing less than paradise on Earth. And it's obvious that not just anyone will be allowed to enter this paradise, right? Therefore, Soviet people had to evolve together with the state in order to be worthy to live in it. The Soviet authorities did not conceal the fact that they intended to create a new, improved human being. After all, without this, it is impossible to build true communism. From each according to his abilities and to each according to his needs. Let us see what this Soviet Homo Novus was supposed to be, what steps were taken by the authorities, and how the population of the Soviet country reacted to it. The term Soviet man as something absolutely unique was not invented by me, of course. And it was used both positively and negatively. The Soviet authorities widely used the term Soviet man in the official press to emphasize the positive qualities inherent in the citizens of the USSR, which emerged thanks to the Soviet power. The concept of Homo Novus was also discussed by Nikolai Chernyshevsky, whose works had a great influence on Vladimir Lenin. In the West, however, the Latin terms Homo Sovieticus and Homo Sovieticus were often used to describe Soviet people and were used in an exclusively negative way. For example, here are quotes from the books of the creators of this term, Sergei Bulgakov and Alexander Zinoviev, both migrated from the USSR in different years. You will notice how even the appearance of the soldier of the Red Army has changed. He has become somehow animal-like, frightening, especially the sailors. I confess to you that the comrades sometimes seem to me to be creatures completely devoid of spirit and possessing only inferior mental faculties, a special kind of Darwin's monkeys, Homo Sovieticus. Homo Sovieticus is accustomed to live in comparatively bad conditions, ready to face difficulties, constantly expecting the worst. He approves of the actions of the authorities, strives to prevent those who violate the usual forms of behavior, fully supports the leadership, has a standard ideologized consciousness, a sense of responsibility for his country, ready for sacrifices and ready to condemn others to sacrifices. Well, we must give credit to Zinoviev, at least he was ready to also label himself as this kind of subhuman. But today we're going to talk more about the positive traits that a Soviet man should have had, not about the negative ones he possessed, or possessed only in the minds of emigrants resentful of everyone and everything Soviet. But first of all, let us understand why it was necessary to breed a new kind of human being at all. If the Soviet Union was such a great and wonderful state where everything was done for the people and the comfort of their lives, why couldn't we just give people all these benefits without demanding anything in return? Why try to remake human nature itself? Well, as always, there are two versions, one idealized and one realistic. Shall we start with the first one? If we believe the ideologies of the Communist Party, it was necessary for the man of the future to unlock certain reserves in himself that had not been used before, and thanks to them, raise himself to a new height, physically, intellectually and morally. To create a higher social biologic type, or if you please, a Superman, as Trotsky himself said in 1924. Yeah, you thought Superman was invented by DC? S stands for Soviet. But jokes aside, it was well within the ideology of Marxism-Leninism that prevailed in the USSR. Matter is primary, social being determines consciousness, and therefore, under the influence of the surrounding communist paradise, the people for whom this paradise was built will also change. For the better, of course. They will be taller, healthier, smarter, more honest, more selfless. And since such a superhuman with his more developed mind would definitely seize the advantages of communism over all other state systems, he would definitely start spreading it all over the world with great pleasure. The goal of such a person's life should be work. Work on constant self-development and on building a better world for himself and for others. Literally the whole life of the Soviet country that emerged after the revolutionary upheavals and the Civil War was imbued with the expectation of the advent of a new communist world. So in general, people perceived such slogans quite positively. It was a great plan. By the way, it's worth noting that although I'm talking about Soviet man, the term fully included Soviet woman as well. The oppressed position of women was seen as a direct consequence of capitalism. So if private property was abolished, the reason for any discrimination would disappear, and women would become absolutely equal in rights and responsibilities with men. Actually, Marxists believe that the bourgeois family is in fact an economic transaction, and therefore there can be no equal, harmonious relationship in such a marriage. That is why in the early 20s in the Soviet state the ideas of complete rejection of traditional family life, of the role of women as keepers of the hearth, and other things unthinkable for orthodox and conservative Russia were very popular. However, all this quickly came to naught. The emerging demographic crisis forced the propaganda to revert everything. A woman was again expected to be first and foremost a wife and mother, and only then a superhuman and a builder of communism. Nevertheless, it should be noted that the young Soviet state was the most progressive in the world when it came to gender equality. All in all, it all sounds pretty good so far, doesn't it? This is how, for example, this idea was described in 1930 by Alexander Kollontai, the first woman minister in history, and at that time the Soviet ambassador to Sweden. The new life of communism will re-educate, recreate man. The new man will use his individual creative flair and talents to improve this life, where there will no longer be so many problems of the economy and the issues of the relationships of people among themselves, and the question of man and the collective will come to the fore. That is, a new morality. Envy, jealousy, backstabbing and slander will disappear in that happy humanity. There will be neither wars nor murders. And the Soviet education system did focus on many good fundamental values, ideals and realities of socialist life, such as equality, community, selflessness, altruism, friendship, moral relationships, education, work, creativity and concern for the future. So many great things. But it is not for nothing that I said that this expression was used not only by the Soviet leaders themselves, but also by their opponents. What were the negative things they saw in the image of the Soviet man? In fact, there was no strictly defined idea of what exactly this ideal new man should look like, even among the Bolsheviks. But in general, it was clear to contemporaries that this was a conscious, collectivist person who puts the collective above the private. And he was well developed both physically and intellectually. Every committed communist had to strive to become such a person. In addition, the image of turning a person into a machine was very popular. We have the problem of processing people and transforming them into living machines that would be guided in all their actions by new principles, by a new proletarian ideology. I think you can see what the main complaint about this image was. The communists mold the nation into a mindless and soulless herd, completely devoid of anything human, and ready to do anything at the wave of their leader's hand. In some ways, of course, they were right. It was a side effect of the very collectivism that the young Soviet Union so strived for. If a person exclusively identifies himself as a part of the collective and does not distinguish his own personality, where will outstanding scientists, writers, poets and thinkers come from in such a society? Do you know many philosopher bees? They are too busy working for the good of the hive to philosophize. The second grievance was that the communists put a very heavy emphasis on children and youth in their ideological processing. To remake human nature is not an easy task. Therefore, people who had lived most of their lives in pre-revolutionary times seemed to be much less promising material for the Bolsheviks than children and adolescents. It was much harder to convert adults than to deal with children. And it's understandable that few people liked it when their children were brainwashed through schools, through pioneer groups, through children's literature, even if it was for a good purpose. Besides, there was no consensus among the Bolsheviks themselves as to how to mold this Superman. For example, in the late 1920s, the question, does a Soviet child really need fairy tales, was discussed in all seriousness. It was suggested to replace them with summaries of grain crops and stories about the most productive workers in factories and kolkhozes. Finally, the way in which this whole process was described by Soviet figures was also questionable. For example, in 1922, the educator Pavel Blonsky wrote that, along with crop and livestock breeding, there should be a science that is homogeneous with them – human breeding. Or Stalin's speech in 1934 that people must be carefully and attentively cultivated, as a gardener cultivates a favorite fruit tree. Yes, some may see an image of a caring and omnipotent grandfather Stalin, who lovingly waters every Soviet person with his wisdom in this. And some might see the analogy that for the Soviet authorities an ordinary person is no more valuable than a tree. They grow it for a certain mission and then they can mercilessly cut it down if necessary. Finally, it is worth noting that the image of the ideal Soviet man has changed over the years. While in the 20s, Soviet psychology and pedagogy proposed free sexual relations as one of the main options for building a communist society, within 10 years such relations were already considered undesirable. By the 1930s, the authorities decided that the Soviet man was more in need of discipline and obedience to the authorities than self-improvement and self-knowledge. In addition, if earlier a Soviet man had to reject such a relic of the past as loyalty to his country, because soon there would be no countries, only a communist international, then later patriotism became the main quality of a Soviet man, helped to a great extent by World War II. Only one thing did not change. The word of the party and its leaders was perceived in this construct as the ultimate truth. It was up to them to decide how to mold a decent Soviet man out of a child lump of clay. The entire Soviet country was initially, in a certain sense, a large educational project, where the authorities acted as teachers and the country's inhabitants were a priori being educated. What came out of it? Let us first outline the four main qualities that a Soviet person should possess according to the party's plan: love for the Soviet country, collectivism, altruism, discipline. To be honest, according to the original idea, there should have been a fifth quality: revolutionary spirit, active desire to participate in changes and fight for them. But you understand, the world revolution somehow did not work out, and if we continue to nurture the revolutionary spirit in people, then one day it may turn the wrong way, so let's forget about that one. Just focus on the first four. Did it work? On the whole, yes. Soviet people truly believed that they lived in the best country in the world. Patriotism was nothing to be ashamed of, and it was sincere.
Завидуйте, я гражданин Советского Союза!
Collectivism? Also yes, a Soviet man could not imagine his life without being a part of the group. Altruism, and again, yes, for example, no one questioned that the USSR spent huge sums of money every year to help starving children in Africa, and yet there were regular shortages on store shelves. Sincerity and willingness to sacrifice themselves to serve the common cause, they were really inherent in Soviet people. Discipline. It is more complicated here, but nevertheless in general Soviet people could really easily subordinate themselves to the requirements of social duty. But there was a certain dissonance here. On the one hand, the Soviet man is a generous collectivist, loving his homeland and passionate about some idea for the good of all mankind. On the other hand, he always had a small advisor hanging over his shoulder, reminding him, "You're part of the group, just a cog in the machine. Stay out of the way, keep your head down, whatever happens." How can all these great ideas of creating a better society be implemented under such conditions? Shouldn't we just leave everything as it is, keep a low profile? In addition, despite all the right ideas of equality and social justice, everyone was aware of the presence of the party elite, people who live behind 3-meter fences and clearly by some different standards than those that had been hammered into everyone from early childhood. Critics pointed out the lack of initiative and boldness of Soviet people, their indifference to the quality of their labor, their lack of ambition, and their opportunism. And now it is obvious that this was a conscious policy of the USSR leadership, to form the passiveness of the population, readiness to follow any orders, limiting its contacts with the outside world. After all, why did the Soviet authorities restrict people's travel abroad so much, even to friendly socialist countries? Were they afraid that people would stay there? Did they not trust the man they themselves had created? The very man who loved the Soviet country above all else? Yes, because the idealistic reflections of the 20s about creating Superman collided with the real world, in which it was more important not to create a paradise society for people, but to create it for themselves, for the ruling elite. It was possible to maintain the situation only if the society was taught not to ask unnecessary questions, and first of all, not by fear, but by education. As a result, a Soviet man turned out to be as contradictory as the Soviet country itself. An unenterprising altruist, a disciplined slacker, a highly intelligent and cultured cog in the machine. An ideal inhabitant for a country that simultaneously managed to propagandize that all people are brothers and periodically profess practically state anti-Semitism. A country that has achieved great success in providing its citizens with social benefits, free housing, medicine, education, vacations, pensions, but at the same time could not provide them with a stick of sausage without a 2-hour line. A country that built unique spacecraft, but could not create enough affordable household appliances for its citizens. If you ask me, the epitome of the concept of a Soviet man is Sergei Korolev, a brilliant engineer and scientist, a man who was thrown into the Klimuk camps by his native country on completely fabricated charges, where he was beaten, tortured and almost died. But he did not break. He survived all the trials and made his country the first in the world. Because he really loved his country and his life's work. In return, his country made him world famous. But only after his death. That's the paradox. Thanks for watching. So, what do you think? Was the Soviet man something unique, or were the people living in the USSR just people like everywhere else and the Bolsheviks failed to accomplish what they wanted? Let me know in the comments. And as always, a huge shout out to my biggest supporters: Yelizaveta Zakharova, Kirill, Klimuk, Böse, Albin, Ilic, Petar, Ilic and Bruce Eternick. See you guys next time.